A moment of divine connection, how Jesus prays. It was a quiet evening in the hills of Gethsemane. The sun had just set, casting a golden glow across the olive trees, as Jesus led his disciples up the familiar path. They had gathered to pray, as they did often, but this night was different. There was an undeniable heaviness in the air. Jesus had been speaking of trials to come, of betrayals and suffering, and the disciples could sense that something significant was about to unfold. As they arrived at a secluded spot in the garden, Jesus turned to the disciples and said softly, "Sit here while I go and pray." The weight of the moment hung around him, but Jesus, knowing the depths of what awaited him, still sought the quiet solitude of prayer. He invited Peter, James, and John to follow him further into the garden, and there, in the silence of the olive trees, they stood witness to something profoundly intimate and deeply sacred. Part 1. The Solitude of Prayer. Jesus stepped away from his disciples, taking a few more steps until he was alone, just him and the Father. He fell to his knees as the night air began to chill, and the soft rustling of leaves was the only sound around him. In that moment, Jesus was entirely alone. His heart was heavy, knowing what was to come, the betrayal by Judas, the denial by Peter, and the path that led to the cross. Yet in the midst of it all, his prayer was not one of fear or bitterness. He looked upward, his face full of anguish, and began to speak to God with words that flowed like a deep river. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." These words, so full of emotion, reflected Jesus' deep humanity. He felt the weight of what was to come, but his commitment to the will of the Father was unwavering. In this simple plea, there was surrender, a total letting go of his own desires in the face of the ultimate sacrifice. His prayer was not just words, it was an expression of his deep trust in the Father's plan. Part 2. The Inner Struggle. Jesus withdrew again, but the weight of the request was overwhelming. His thoughts were filled with the coming agony, and his spirit felt the anguish of the task ahead. As he returned to his disciples, they had fallen asleep, overcome by the weight of the evening. Jesus looked at them with a tender sadness. "Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with a gentle rebuke. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He returned to pray once more, the struggle within him intensifying. His prayer became more urgent, his heart crying out to God, wrestling with the reality of the cross. He fell to the ground again, his body weak, his soul torn between the divine will and the human cost. "Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." This second prayer reflected a deeper surrender, a resolution to accept the suffering that lay ahead. The silence of the garden echoed with the struggle between obedience and pain. His prayer was both a cry and a submission, an example of the human struggle to align one's will with God's purpose. Part 3. The Final Surrender. The third time, Jesus returned to pray, and this time there were no words of pleading. The battle in his heart had been fought, and he had found peace in the Father's will. The disciples, still asleep, remained unaware of the struggle that had just taken place between Jesus and his Father. When Jesus prayed this time, there was no longer any sign of fear. His words were clear, confident in their surrender, knowing that whatever the cost, God's will was the highest calling. "Not my will, but yours be done." With these words, Jesus finished his prayer. In that moment, he had fully embraced the path ahead. The weight of the world's sins would soon be placed upon him, but he had come to peace with the Father's plan. His prayer, from anguish to peace, had been the bridge between the human and the divine, showing his followers that it was okay to wrestle with God, but to ultimately surrender to his will. As the prayer ended, an angel appeared to strengthen him. Jesus stood up, resolved in his purpose, ready to face what was to come. The peace that had descended upon him was not one of absence of pain, but one of purpose, of knowing that his mission was about to unfold. Jesus returned to his disciples, gently waking them. "The hour has come," he said. "The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." With his prayer, Jesus had not only prepared himself, but had shown his disciples the power of trusting in God's will, through moments of doubt, fear, and even despair. It was a prayer that revealed both his humanity and his divine submission, a model for all who seek to understand the depth of prayer and surrender.